Welcome to the Wilderness Season podcast. I'm your host, Sherry Ward. I have a passion to bring hope and breakthrough to those experiencing the toughest times of their lives. In this podcast, we will give you critical insights and revelations as I interview people just like you, those who have been right where you are and understand exactly what a wilderness season is all about. It's real, it's raw, it's practical. Come join the conversation. Welcome to the Wilderness Season podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Wilderness Season podcast. I'm your host, Sherry Ward, and with me today is Rob Miner, my co-host. So good to be back in studio, so to speak, and not...
No, we've been doing it from home of late.
Yeah, and not on your... just looking at each other on the laptop.
It's a lot easier.
Yeah. So today's topic that we're going to talk about is transitioning out of the wilderness. Mm-hmm. And this is a big one that nobody talks about. They talk about the wilderness season, but they don't always talk about that transition or what I call the crossing over. Mm-hmm. You know, what does that look like? That's an actual season, I believe, that nobody talks about. It's that crossing the Jordan season, that transitioning out of the old and into the new. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about the transition season? Was it an actual season for you? Did you feel it like coming into
You're
it?
using the past tense as if it's over. My perspective is, the wilderness, the crossing over the promised land, to some degree, there's a blending together. Like if you ask me, what are the parameters of your wilderness season? What are the parameters of your crossover? What are the parameters? Like I might be in my promised land, maybe 10% my promised land, 30%. On any given day, it's hard to tell. But I definitely have seen progression. There's definitely forward movement I see. There's definitely things that I can recognize that I've learned in the wilderness. And so there's definitely been some element of crossing over. There's definitely been some element of having crossed over and now in my promised land.
Oh, that's good too, yeah.
So I thought of 5 different characteristics of, when I think about Israel's 40 years in the wilderness.
Yeah.
What are the first 5 things that come to mind in terms of what kept them in the wilderness? And then how do we move from those mindsets and learn to abide in that promised land mentality?
That's awesome. For me, the one thing that always comes to my mind, okay, and I'm going to do a girl analogy on you, a woman analogy, so bear with me because it might be like...
I'm the bride of Christ. I can handle it.
It might be a little TMI, but I always think of transitional labor. And when you're transitioning in the labor, because I feel like the wilderness is a lot of painful experiences, like you're being tested, you're being pulled. It's not always...
It would have been too much for me 2-3 years ago, but now I'm like, oh yeah, no, I totally know you're
No, I totally get it. But that transition is like the transitional labor, and I feel like it's Satan's last-ditch effort to get you off focus and off task and off your what God has for you right before you come in the promised land. So nobody warned me about this. So for you viewers out there or listeners, we really want to tell you, look, be aware that when you're transitioning, that there's a lot going on. It's a vulnerable place, just like in labor. There's the contractions of the wilderness, if that's what we're going to call this as an example. They intensify. Mm-hmm. They get shorter together. It feels like you're getting hit more and more and more, and you're just getting slammed right before you cross over. And another analogy, and again, this is going to be a little TMI, but if you don't have those contractions to expand you, then when the baby comes out, if it comes out too early, it will rip you. So it's that tearing and because you're not ready for what's about to hit. So I feel like the wilderness and the transitional part are all in preparation for expanding you to not only come into your promised land, but to take it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That analogy works. I can really relate to that right now because, the contractions are getting stronger. They're getting more frequent. And that's why, because God is expanding me. And, we are used to what we're used to. And so when God starts stretching us, by nature, we kind of freak out. We get anxious. We get fearful. We go into that old mindset of how we're going to adapt to those changes. And that's partly what God is doing, is he's breaking us free from all the different ways we used to adapt in the past. It's like, no, you don't understand. I'm driving this ship.
Yeah.
You don't need to. You just keep going.
Yeah.
And that's the theme of our next podcast after this one, is just keep going forward.
Yeah.
Because, when the contractions get tighter, I mean, there's been several times in the last few weeks where I've heard the words come out of my mouth. I want to just throw in the towel. Like, I tap out.
Yeah. I can't relate at all. No idea what you're talking about at all.
Like, I'm not going to do that, because you reach a certain point where, like, surrender is no longer an option. But there's definitely that temptation where you just want to escape the stretching.
Well, I just always think of that scripture with Peter where he's like, I've come so far, I have nowhere else to go, God. It's like I've come so far in this wilderness journey, like there's not even a way I can turn around and go back. It's like you have to keep going in that. And one other part of transition, and using that baby analogy, is that in those contractions and in that transitional period, the baby inside is actually being positioned. So it gets in proper position. It comes down in the cervix. It's in the right position for birth.
It wasn't too much information for me. I was going to look around. I'm like, okay, I get the illustration.
Yeah. But I mean, and I feel like in this period of transitioning, it's an alignment. It's a positioning. Yeah. It's lining everything up for what you're coming into, because you're birthing something. You're birthing something new that's never been birthed before.
Right.
And it has to come into alignment, and it has to come into the right position. Because like one of my boys, he was upside down. It's breech. It's called breech. And they had to do a C-section, which was horrible because I got infections and all this kind of stuff. So because he wasn't in proper alignment, I had to go through a lot, and the way that the baby came out had to be completely different because of the alignment was off. So I feel like a lot of this has always gone back to the one thing that God told me over and over in the wilderness was trust. Because you have to trust him that he's got this, that he's putting things in proper alignment, that he's positioning things in just the right way, even though we have no idea what's going on.
And that's the key, is that he's putting things into proper alignment.
Yeah.
Because as I listen to you, I'm trying to identify, I'm like, I can see that. I can see how God's aligning certain things, but I don't know what's going on. I'm just kind of following wherever the wind takes me, and in the process I look back a month or two later and go, I can see how he's aligning me here and disaligning me there.
Yeah, because even a woman can't align the baby up. The baby just gets in alignment because it's natural, and that's what happens. Right. So it's that trusting God through every step that we're going through, and I think that's so critical, and he's just continuing to tell me that, even though it's been years that he's told me that.
Well, yeah, and that's a lot of what the stretching is the stretching represents being pushed into something that I can't do in my own strength. Like, whatever I'm moving towards, at some point, God has to meet me there. God has to make divine connections. God needs to give me a certain level of divine favor. There's certain things that need to line up that I have no control over.
Yeah.
And that can be very stressful.
But people that you meet, divine connections, but also people that, unfortunately, there's people that are not going to cross over with you. And that's kind of a sad moment, and you might grieve that they're not coming with you. But in the same sense, you can't stay just for the sake of staying for them.
Right.
You have to make that crossover.
But at the same time, when you go into promised land, there's things God has to, like you said, line up. Like, there's people he needs to put in your path.
Exactly.
There's things that need, and when those pieces are not in place yet, it can get stressful because you're moving toward that in faith, that those things are going to start to line up as you continue to go.
And it's exactly like the analogy in the Bible, because when they crossed the Jordan, versus when they crossed the Red Sea. When they crossed the Red Sea, Moses put out his staff, it parted, they walked. But it's completely different crossing the Jordan, because they didn't put out the staff and the whole thing, backed up and they walked across. For crossing the Jordan, and when they crossed over, the the priest with the ark had to put their feet in the water that was overflowing. And once they put their feet in, that's when the waters receded. So there's a difference.
It's interesting. I never thought of that before with the Red Sea, because I always thought, two of the same. In both cases, Moses put his staff into the ground, the waters part, but that's not really what happened with the Jordan River. With the Red Sea, it was one man. Moses put his staff in the water, and then with the Jordan River, it was the whole priesthood that essentially took that leap of faith.
Yeah.
Why don't we do this? You're free to take whatever direction you want with this. I thought of 5 different characteristics of the wilderness season. I wanted to make this very practical to give people some practical steps.
Yes, because you're the teacher.
So, my 5-point list.
I know.
Just to, so people get in touch with, okay, are there any mindsets or any broken records that I need to take off?
Mm-hmm.
I want to make this as specific as possible.
Okay. Go for it.
So number 1, characteristics of the wilderness. I said, you keep looking back to Egypt. I remember reading the story of the Israelites going through the wilderness, and there was this temptation to keep looking back at Egypt and longing for what
the leeks and the onions and the whatever.
Life was so good as a slave. At least then I knew, what to expect.
It was the familiar.
It was familiar.
Yeah, it's comfortable.
Yeah, it's what I had always known. So in a sense, is it slavery if all you've ever known is slavery? And so that's part of what the wilderness does is, in the wilderness, they were constantly taking up their tent and walking. It's like, no, I'd like to just camp here for a while. I pitched my tent. Do I have to keep putting this tent down every night? Can I just settle down?
Funny.
And so I know for me, my, I guess, crossing over season, you could say, started in December 2014 when I had this Matthew 6:33 epiphany: seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added as well. And over the next few years, where certain relationships got brought into my life, I had just gone through a divorce. My divorce had processed just maybe a year or so prior. And so that was one of the things I was really hoping for. Same with ministry, things I was really believing for.
Yeah.
And there's a real temptation to, there's been a temptation for years to go back and think, I wish I had done that differently, or that could have worked. Why didn't that work? Or, that ministry model was geared and ready to go. It's so easy to look back and reflect on what could have been.
Well, I think sometimes we look back on things that were dysfunctional that worked just because we were so used to it. But
that's
not
exactly it. It wasn't dysfunctional at the time because that's who I was.
Yeah.
It was my lifestyle. That's what
But now you're different. And now you can't go back.
Right.
And the only way through is forward. And there's a lot of pain in that. I remember that transition period especially was a lot of pain. And I'm just going to be really honest. When I went through a lot of pain, I just started binge watching TV. Certain shows on TV just because I didn't want to think about it. And it was kind of my way of checking out and just binge watching, everybody has their stuff. Maybe it's food, TV, whatever it is, just to do anything to relieve that pain because it's very painful.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the signs that you're crossing over or that you have crossed over to some degree is you kind of learn to brush off the dust and move on.
Yeah,
Which leads me to point number 2, which I call the broken record syndrome. Let's see, where am I? Number 2. You keep going around in circles. I don't know exactly what the geographical distance was. I've heard it was something like a 21-day journey that lasted 40 years.
11-day journey.
Was it an 11-day journey?
11-day journey.
Yeah. And this is not 11 days. I remember Carolyn Leaf, who is a Christian, works with
the mind
and renewing the mind, all that. I think she said once that it takes 21 days to break a mental rut. Like if for 21 days you can be perfect and not going back to that same mental pattern, you can break it.
Right.
And I think it's the same idea is we all have broken records. In a sense, we're all a dog chasing its tail, going around in circles, playing the same fouls over and over.
Yeah.
It can be anything from, regretting a decision you made in the past to questioning God. God, why this? That was a big one for me. I got stuck there for years.
Wyoming.
Or Wyoming.
You have to watch another podcast to get that joke.
Right. We're not going to go back there again. Maybe it's just an idol that hasn't been broken.
Yeah.
You keep going back and like, if I had this is what will make me happy.
Yeah.
I'll just give a very, very practical example. Right now, for whatever reason, whenever I leave my house, I'll check the stove and the thermostat twice, sometimes literally 3 times, where I'll check the stove before I leave in the morning.
Yeah.
And then I'm walking out the front door and I have to go back and check.
I've done that with my curling iron.
And I'm like, this is dysfunctional. Like, this is not healthy. Why? Like, I'm always afraid that, and that's kind of a small thing. But when you come into the promised land, there are no small things. Wherever
Right.
you recognize a fear, something that's off, we need to check those things and say, God, I need to cut this out at the root. Where am I allowing fear to come in? Where's that broken record that I keep playing?
That keep going around and around. I remember, just going around that tree, so to speak, in the wilderness over and over and over again. There is another analogy that I've heard before that I thought was really interesting, and it was the potter and the clay. Mm-hmm. And that when he puts the clay on the wheel goes round and round. And every time you go around, he's shaping and shaping and shaping and shaping. And if you do things the best that you can in the wilderness and listening to God and obeying and doing what you feel in your heart that you're supposed to do, I feel like, even though it feels like, oh my gosh, I went around that tree 500 times and here's the 501 times. Yeah.
It's part of the process.
If you have that analogy of, okay, it's just one more spin on the potter's wheel, that he's chipped off one more thing into making me who he wants me to make, come into. I don't know. I feel like then you don't feel like you're just spinning out, but you're spinning towards.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the big picture, it took Israel 40 years to go through the wilderness. It took Jesus 40 days. So ideally, that's our goal.
40 days.
Good luck with that.
Good luck.
Because, we are human, and it just takes time. We are jars of clay. There's a reason Jesus had to die first. We could not save ourselves. We cannot just get on this self-improvement program and pull up our bootstraps and be like, okay, I'll be out of this wilderness in 40 days.
Oh, heck no. I wish. I so wish.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
There was one point in the wilderness where I had to literally tell the Lord, I will be here as long as it takes to get out of me everything that needs to get out of me in order for me to enter the promised land. That was the hardest declaration or submission to the Lord I've ever had to do. So that submitted me to like, okay, if it takes me 20 years, I'll be here. And that was really hard because I was doing the whole, if I be a good old girl Christian, then I'll get out of here as fast as possible because I'm going to be the most obedient person you have ever seen, God. I'm going to perform for you. I'm going to be so obedient and I'm going to get out of here quick. And it's like I had to give up control of the timing.
It's kind of funny, though. At least it's funny for me when I think about this, because I spent
good old girl. No,
I mean, I spent years having conversations like this with God, and we're just wrestling with God, like, okay, I submit, I surrender. I remember
he's probably laughing sometimes. Yeah.
It's like we keep negotiating. We keep going back to the contractual agreement. Like, okay, I'll give you this. I'm not going to give you this. Well, I might give you this. Hold on, let me get back to you in 2 weeks.
Let me get back to you in 2 weeks. I love that.
One of these experiences I had, I have to laugh every time I have it. At the time, I think I cried more than I laughed. But this one time, this was like 7, 8 years ago, I was like, I'm done. Like,
tap out.
Take that A plan you have for me, rip up the contract. I'm done. Give me the B plan. I'm out. done.
Tap
Do you
out.
hear
Where's
me?
the bell?
Get the angel, get the contract, rip it up. I'm done. And then I went to sleep and had a dream.
Oh no. Oh no. I want to hear this one. I haven't heard this one yet.
So I have this dream, and in the dream, I'm evangelizing to some guy, like trying to get some guy saved.
Yeah.
And he turns around to me and said, "It's funny you say that, because my Bible tells me you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you."
Oh, wow.
And I woke up, I'm like, what was that? It's almost like God turned around. He's like, "I'm sorry, you think you can renegotiate this contract?" No, I chose you.
I love that.
And of course, you can interpret that as saying, okay, well, does that mean I don't have a free will? No, I've been on this journey long enough to realize if I really meant that, and God knew I meant it, he would have granted me that.
He would have honored that, yeah.
But he knew me, and he knew my future.
Yeah.
He's like, "Trust me, Rob. You don't want me to rip it. I love you so much, I'm not
going to rip it up. Oh, that's good. That's a really good one.
Because I know what the present you is choosing.
Yeah.
But I also know what the future you will choose. And the future you would grab your hands and give me that contract and say, "You are not going to rip up that contract."
Oh, that's so good. So say that your future you would tell your past you not to rip it up.
God didn't honor my present me because he knew my future me would not.
Oh, I love that. I love every part of that. Wow, that's so good. Okay, that's worth the episode right there, guys.
So that's one of the ways we put on the broken record player.
Yeah.
Where we go around in circles is we keep negotiating with God. My main prayer right now is,
help.
Not even now. It's more like, Lord, I give you my whole life. I give you my hands. I give you my eyes.
Yeah.
I give you my mind. I give you my mouth. My life is surrendered to you. Like, I'll pray these other things, but it's like that's ice on the cake. I'm like, I surrender. You take the driver's seat. I'll get in the passenger seat. I'll go along. Everything else is nice if it's added onto me. But because I spent so much of my life wrestling with God, trying to reserve something for myself, as opposed to truly trusting him with everything.
That's good. That's good. Because we're trying to hold back or grab something because we don't trust that he's a loving God and will give it to us. It's like we have to hold it back.
Which gets me to point number 3.
Of course. Of course.
Wilderness characteristic number 3. You instinctively don't trust Moses or the God who sent Moses. Now I'm speaking, metaphorically, but as a result, you keep grumbling because they grumbled because they didn't ultimately trust God.
Yeah.
So one thing I've learned to do, we're still human beings. We still feel pain. We still at times, like, God.
Help.
But there's a difference between processing your pain in a way that takes you closer to God and processing your pain in a way that pulls you from God.
I agree with that. I fully agree with that.
You can even pray. You can be talking to God and be pulled away at the same time. Because God's love language is faith. It's trust. So if you're venting for an hour, and you're just venting, that's not getting,
any closer.
Not building a relationship here. He loves us. He's gracious. He'll like, okay, tell me when you're done. But, learning to lean in and just say, okay, God, I don't understand this. This is frustrating. And this doesn't make any sense at all. But you know what? We're doing it. We're doing it.
I'm in. I'm all in. It's like I'm all in.
What can you do? Yeah.
I remember one time he said, endure, endure, endure. Will you go through this process with me? And the way that he said it was so endearing. He said, endure, endure, endure. Will you go through this process with me? And it's like, how could you say no? No. But he said it so lovingly and so endearing that's like, okay, God, I'll endure with you. I don't understand. I will trust you. I don't know how I'm going to trust you, but I'll trust you. It's one of those like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but, my heart wants to. And I think you look at the heart more than anything. And so just help me.
It's interesting that you say that, because you could say, well, endure with him. Isn't it more like he's enduring with us? He's not going through the trial. I am. But, Paul says, I pick up my cross daily. I think there's something in the heart of God. It's not that he's tried and are trying, but I don't know, at some mystical level, he is. It's like he comes into our world. And I'll give you an example. I remember one of the prophetic words I received almost 20 years ago. He said, I see you as Peter of Cyrene carrying the Lord's cross.
Mm.
So Peter, when Jesus was going up Calvary, and he stumbled and he couldn't carry the cross anymore, Peter was the guy that helped him carry the cross up the hill.
Yeah.
And I think going into your promised land, that crossing over journey, is kind of a metaphor of that, or that's kind of a metaphor of going into your promised land, or going through the crossing over, going through the birthing stages.
Yeah.
Where, in a sense, you are identifying with Christ in his sufferings. There's a very real death in the process, as the death of your natural ways.
Yeah.
And basically come to that place of choosing. It's like, I choose to follow you in this land of mystery, this land where I no longer have control over my life. My life is in your hands.
I remember one time I was at a conference and the speaker said, okay, what do you guys want to get out of this conference? And I remember saying, and he wrote it on the little whiteboard, I said, I want the puzzle box top. And he's like, what do you mean by that? I go, well, I want to know the box top to the puzzle so I know how to put all the pieces together. And he's like, okay. And he wrote it down on the board. And I prayed fervently prayer.
Think that would be enough.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, God, just show me the box top. And by the end of the conference, and he waited, of course, till Sunday night at the end of the conference, and said, I'm not going to give you the box top. Because if I give you the box top, you're going to try to control the whole thing and try to put all the puzzle pieces together. Right. Okay. I have to give up the box top, not knowing what the picture's going to look like in the end. And that was part of the faith journey and the trust.
And you'll get the box top, 40 years later. But
yeah.
The scripture in Proverbs, it's the glory of kings to seek out a matter, the glory of God to conceal it. One of the names I have for God is the puzzle piecing God. It's not the catchiest title.
Yeah, really.
I need to work on the title. But the idea that, and this is why I know there's different denominations, and some people maybe don't believe in the prophetic nature of the Christian walk. But for me, that's so central to this Abrahamic journey we're on.
Yeah.
We have to move beyond just the written word of God, because Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like a seed planted in the field that grew and expanded 30, 60, 100-fold. The word of God is alive. We have the Holy Spirit living God in us. There is an interrelationship between the Logos word and the living word of God that is taking us on this living, breathing journey. And so for me, the prophetic, whether you hear dreams or visions or just divine connections, there's so many different ways we can hear from God. Whether you believe in the prophetic or not, we all have had experiences as believers where we're like, I could have sworn God said this or that to me. I could have sworn that was God. I could have sworn that was God's footprints in the sand.
Right.
And the recognition of those footprints in the sand is what keeps us going. Which, by the way, takes me to point number 4. But you go ahead and respond first.
Yeah, I love the prophetic, because the prophetic's what really helped me get through the wilderness. Because when I was reading the Bible, then that helped. But then I could stand also on the promises that he'd either given me personally or through a prophetic word. And I think stewarding those well in the wilderness will really help you. And I know a lot of times people will record them on their phone, or you can write them down. I write down all of them. and I have them typed up. I have them in a notebook, and I actually still go back to these,
I do too.
and even last week I was going back through some of them because it encourages me. It's a way to build myself up and encourage me as I'm going through these hard times or transitioning. Just saying it out loud even is very, very powerful.
Oh, I absolutely say them out loud. And going back to the puzzle piece making God and how it correlates to the Abrahamic journey, some of our listeners or viewers might be, or may have wondered at some time, how is it you can get a word 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and it's almost like it's spoken in the present tense.
Yeah.
And then you find kind of place like, oh my God, now I know what God meant by that.
Yeah.
But when I received it, it felt like it was for now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for all this time, I'm like, well, I guess that never came to pass. And one thing I've seen in my journey, and I think this is part of the crossing over, is you have all these footprints in the sand.
Yeah.
I've received a lot of prophecies, but I've had a lot of experiences with God myself where, I felt like God said this, that, or the other. And so there's all these puzzle pieces over time that God has spoken. And then as you get closer, or at least this is my experience, and I think you can relate, where the pieces start to come together.
Yeah, yeah.
And, it's still, I still can't figure out what the puzzle is, but it's getting more and more pieced together.
Yeah.
And so let's say you just have a chunk. You just have, okay, these 4 or 5 puzzle pieces fit together. But I now understand what God is saying about that. And so I can now walk in that.
Yeah,
like
that's
I have
a good
become
analogy. Really,
that piece of the puzzle. And I'm becoming this piece of the puzzle. And the more the pieces start to fit together, and the more I start to get a clearer vision of who God ultimately created me to be, I am now becoming the walking embodiment of those words.
Yeah, and I think it's a convergence.
Yeah.
Convergence is a good word, but I love that analogy of, because when you do a puzzle, it's like, okay, let me do all the skies, and get all the blues and, put the sky together, and, oh, that's a bridge, so let's put all the pieces with the bridge. So that's a really cool analogy that you get these chunks. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you the end of that story, because in the promised land, what he's been doing is bringing things full circle for me, and things that he has said or done, he's now explaining it on the back end. Mm-hmm. And it's been such a cool experience to see that. And one of the things that he did recently is he said, okay, are you ready? Do you want the box top to the puzzle? And I'm like, really? He's like, no, no, I waited all these years. No, psych, you're out. No. And I said, absolutely. And so he showed me the box top to the puzzle. And what he said is, I can now trust you with it. So here's the box top that you've been asking for. And I literally, Rob, this was, I don't know, 7-8 years ago that I asked for that. And he's just now giving it to me. So it's been sweet. All right. Yeah. So what's your next one on your list?
All right. So number 4 is, one of the characteristics of the wilderness is we're tired of this stupid manna. So I've quoted this several times in earlier podcasts. When Jesus came out of the wilderness, he says, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And I've said this is ultimately the key of crossing over to the other side. Because if you trace that back to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says God gave them manna in the wilderness, which neither they nor their fathers knew about, in order that they would learn that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And so there you see the connection. But what does that look like? So our next podcast is going to be titled Just Keep Going. Or maybe it's titled something else, but that's the thing.
That's the title you want.
That's the title I want. But what the manna in the wilderness is those footprints in the sand. Now, it's not that we get a prophetic word every day, or a dream every day, or even a divine wink every day, but every day, God's grace is sufficient. When Paul said, I had this thorn in my flesh, and I prayed for God to take it away, and 3 times God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. And that's one of the things we develop as we just keep going, is that no matter how dark a day is, no matter how confused or how much we get derailed or how much we're like game over. God's grace is new every morning. And we just trust that as we keep going, he will sustain us. That is what it means by the manna in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We want the crown jewels of the promised land. We want to come into Pharaoh's palace and kick our feet up and live the abundant life that Joseph had. But in the meantime, we are learning to stand on this premise. I recognize my timeline is running out. I recognize I don't have enough money. I recognize that, my health keeps kicking up. Whatever it is, that's all peripheral. But every day, God's grace is sufficient. Every day, before I even wake up, I know God's going to do something that will sustain me to just keep going.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's really good. And then you had 5, right? So that's all 5. I just want to make sure you got through your list as a teacher.
Yeah.
Because it's going to bug you if you didn't.
Can't do that. And these are all related. But number 5, the story of the 12 spies. Joshua and Caleb came back and they said, God has given us the land. And the other 10 came back with a negative report. And this was not number 5 on my list, but I'm glad we're ending with this one because I do believe that God is getting ready to do something pretty substantial.
Yeah.
I really believe we're coming into something quite amazing on a national and even a global scale. And I don't want to get into too much of the specifics of that, maybe on another podcast. But I do believe if there was ever a time to take hold of this story and say, you know what, I want to walk with Joshua and Caleb. I don't want to be one of those 10 other spies. This is a good time to really press into God and say, look, God, I don't understand how I'm going to come into my promised land. I don't understand the bigger plans you have for my life. But I'm tired of that broken record. I'm tired of questioning you, doubting you. Yeah, I may feel fear at times. Yes, I may feel the desire to grumble. Done with this. But God, I choose to believe.
Yeah.
You are the God who is able to finish the good work that I've begun. Yes, there's giants in the land, and yes, those giants are going down.
Oh, good word. Good word. I love that. I want to add one more thing, and I want to go back to the transitioning labor, which I know I'm kind of going backwards, but I think in the crossing over season, it's going to be important who you allow to speak into your life. So you're giving people voice in your life, and I think it's going to be really, really important who you give voice to at that time, because you have to be really careful, because like you said, the 10 spies said negative stuff, and then Joshua and Caleb didn't. So you have to be really careful, because those 10 people swayed an entire nation.
Good word.
So
sobering word, but good word.
Yeah, so you're going to have to be very, very careful in that delicate transitional labor where you're very vulnerable, who you allow into your life. And I want to read, Lana Vosser had a prophetic word last year.
Let me stop real quick, just to put a exclamation mark on what you just said. So I finally have done, I don't know if I've never done this, but I finally gathered a prayer group. I've been,
that's awesome.
For months, I'm like, I need a prayer team. Like what I'm coming into, I can't do this alone.
Yeah.
And I have a Facebook group with, over 200 members. I have a group of 12 friends. It's part of a daily text log I have. I have other friends at work, friends in my church. I have family.
Yeah.
I devised this list. I dwindled this list down to 3 people. And one person lives in Arizona, and one person lives in Texas and is moving to Chicago.
Yeah.
And a year ago, I didn't know any of these 3 people.
Wow.
But I chose these people because it's been this great dwindling where it's like, I can't even afford a fraction of unbelief. Like these people are all in. They're like, we totally believe in what you're doing. It's like, good. Everyone else, love you, but just
it's your inner circle right now.
I just can't open myself up to any negativity or even I had one person say, like, Rob, maybe you should do this. And I'm like, I appreciate your feedback. I can't open myself up to that right now.
Yeah.
I have a vision of what I think God has given me, and I have to run with it.
You're on a
and
mission.
I have to be very, very careful about who I really bring into that inner circle.
And who's speaking into your life.
Right.
And Lana Vosser had a prophetic word about a year ago about the birthing room. She called it the birthing room. And so I want to read this because it was so good. And I think it really pertains to what we're talking about today. And it said, the birthing room is not for crowds. Be wise who you invite in. It is very important right now in what the Lord is birthing that there is not a parading of, look what God's doing in me, or even from the place of excitement of what God is doing, to tell the masses or invite just anyone in. What the Lord was showing me is that the birthing is taking place so deep, it must be protected, it must be treasured, and inviting just anyone in the delivery suite or allowing others to dictate what it has to look like could hinder the birthing. This is not something to be taken lightly or played around with. Make sure that you ask Holy Spirit for wisdom on who to invite into your birthing room journey. For the Lord has specific midwives that he has called to be alongside of you as you birth, but the birthing room is not open to all. It's very important that we allow in our birthing room who we allow. Take heed of whom you feel the Lord has called you to be with during this time. You will be in a very vulnerable position, and you will need to be careful about who you allow into that sacred place.
Bingo. Yeah, that's exactly what I was just saying.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of puts an exclamation point on what you were saying, that in that crossing over season, you are going to be in a vulnerable position, especially if it heats up. It gets more intense, the contractions hit more, and it's that last-ditch effort from the enemy to get you off. You really need people around you that are going to speak what God's speaking over you, because it's going to be really important that you don't get anybody in your world that is going to take you off course at that point. All right. Well, this has been a really good episode.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us on the Wilderness Season podcast. Until next week, we'll see you then. Thank you for listening to the Wilderness Season podcast. If you need help navigating through your own wilderness season, pick up a copy of my book, A Journey Out of the Wilderness, available on Amazon. Also, continue the conversation online with us by going to our Wilderness Season Facebook page. For resources and events, you can go to www.sherrylynnward.com. If you have enjoyed this show, please subscribe and review our podcast. Just remember, you're not alone.